Hey, nice to meet you. Let's talk about quadrilaterals.
What the fuck?
How many times have you been sure you dodged a spike in a video game but still died? Or shot at a monster and watched them take no damage, despite it looking like your bullet hit them cleanly? Have you ever felt like the game is fudging its numbers, making the enemy hit you when you should be out of reach, and not letting you land a blow when you're in what should be the exact same situation? If you've experienced any of these problems, and if you haven't, you're a liar, you've encountered what are known as poor hitboxes. Like many underlying elements of video games, players hardly notice hitboxes unless they are deeply, deeply flawed. But whether you notice them or not, they are one of the most important foundational elements of almost any video game. But what exactly is a hitbox? How is it determined? And what happens when it doesn't align with how the player feels it should be? Well, with the help of my trusty time machine, we are going to attempt to answer these questions and more through responsible use of the fourth dimension. And maybe just a few irresponsible ones. Hitboxes, and related concepts that fall under the umbrella of collision checks, have been utilized in almost every video game imaginable for decades. Essentially, a hitbox is an unseen shape used to determine if one body or object hits another, most commonly in combat scenarios. In early games like Pong, the hitbox was easy to identify because it was everything on the screen. The ball and both paddles were constructed as single rectangles with their spaces for collision precisely encapsulated by their shape. As gaming graphics became more detailed, however, it became more complicated for every collision, between, say, the roly-poly Pac-Man and his spooky pal Clyde, due to the increased number of pixels and later polygons. Simply put, checking every discrete point of possible collision would be hugely taxing for any game machine. To facilitate efficiency, developers decided to instead create invisible ranges in and around characters and objects that, when crossed by a similar space from an opposing force, would register as a hit. Because of their initially rectangular shape, these ranges became known as hitboxes. The original Super Mario Bros. Provides an excellent crash course in hitboxes, primarily because the game has been broken down and studied numerous times by students, speedrunners, and superfans alike. You can see by the rectangles highlighted within each sprite that the hitbox, or in Bowser's case hitboxes, only covers the core shape of its respective creature or object. Rather than worry about making additional smaller boxes to cover each spiny point or blooper tentacle, the game instead opts to leave the edge portions of each sprite, including Mario's, free. Besides making collision far less complicated by having fewer points to check against, this also allows for believable margins of error. Imagine, for a moment, that the edge of every pixel in every sprite counted as a possible collision point. Nicking the toe of Mario's shoe against the tip of a Cheep Cheep's back fin, while technically a hit, would feel wrong. It would feel like a cheap way to die. Pun absolutely intended. This is especially true in bullet hell games, where the number of objects on screen and the speed they're moving is something that the computer can process but the player can't. In these cases, player hitboxes are often only their most central pixel to give the player enough of a margin to actually succeed. By having hitboxes only cover the bulkiest or most central parts of the sprites, death feels more fair. You know, the fact that I'm using emotional terms to describe rectangles just goes to show how unique game design is as an art. Suck it, Pete Mondrian. Now, of course, nothing lasts forever, and as games became more complicated, two-dimensional rectangles weren't enough. By the time we get to Super Smash Bros. Melee, which uses three-dimensional character models in two-dimensional combat, we see single boxes have been replaced with maps of circles and round-edged bars, called capsules, that cover each character in a far more comprehensive manner. The reason for this is twofold. The obvious reason is that, with updated graphic complexity, more complicated collision detection is necessary to retain the right feel of combat across all games. The other is more specific to Super Smash Bros. Melee. As being a fighting game with heavy player versus player leanings, combat is expected to be more fluid and precise than the pattern memorization and head-stomping casual play of its side-scrolling older sibling. Fighting games like the Super Smash Bros. Series also began to differentiate between hitboxes, the portion that deals damage such as a weapon, and hurtboxes, the portion that receives damage, like the head, as combat became more complicated than just throwing bodies at each other. Other genres have adopted this distinction to varying degrees, but the majority of the time just referring to any space on an object capable of collision as a hitbox will be accurate enough. One last thing. It's important to note that hitboxes don't always occupy the same space as the object they belong to. They certainly overlap when the body in question is still, but things get a bit more complicated when you add movement into the mix. To help compensate for human reaction time and lag between connected players, it's not uncommon for hitboxes to move at a slightly different pace to, going back to that magic word, feel correct. Now, with three-dimensional games industry standard, hitboxes are even more complicated. They typically take the form of capsules or cuboids, with several of them pieced together to properly cover models in their complex shapes. They can change shape and position on the fly as characters and objects are moved and modified. The complexity of hitboxes varies depending on the needs of each game, and with gaming more diversified than ever, there's no shortage of variation for what a proper hitbox looks like. Hitboxes are like an IT department. If they're doing their job correctly, most people won't notice them at all. There are exceptions to every rule, but I'm willing to bet the majority of gamers won't praise a new title for its quality hitboxes the same way they would laud its story, soundtrack, or graphical fidelity. But if a game has poor hitboxes, ones that don't accurately portray the shape of the object or seem inconsistent, then you'll never hear the end of it. This is part of why multiplayer games will often utilize alternate systems to help with consistency. Things like lock-on targeting, which largely ignores the question of collision. If you need an example, just load up pretty much any MMO, or check out nerdSlayer's copious dives into the genre. Because hitboxes have been refined over the course of decades, it's pretty easy to figure out where they're going to go next. I expect that until there is a new technological advancements on the same level as the leap from two-dimensional graphics to three-dimensional ones, hitboxes will continue to work as simplified approximations that service the vast majority of situations. After all, people are far more excited about the forward-facing elements of new games, improved graphics, new mechanics, immersive stories, than the underlying infrastructure. Virtual reality gaming brings a new layer of intricacy to the concept of hitboxes, however. Since players actually are the heroes they control, hitboxes will need to be precise enough that players don't feel like their own bodies are betraying them. I expect that the current method of three-dimensional hitboxes will be sufficient for most VR situations, but there's this one game coming out in a few years with a dodge mechanic that requires the most complex hitboxes yet. You thought it was cool back when Neo did a backbend away from bullets? Imagine bullets literally flying between your fingers. Future's nuts, girl. Well, that's hitboxes for you. There's a whole lot to discuss about other kinds of collision detection, but we're out of time today. Well, you are. I have all the time in the world. Hey. Until yesterday, take care.